In 2016, Nintendo was in trouble. The Wii U was on its last legs, not many people had bought it, and the Switch wouldn't come out until 2017. I still have my Wii U, in a box, somewhere. Hope it's doing alright. That meant for Christmas 2016, Nintendo needed a big Christmas release product. Nintendo's solution to this was to look back through its history. What had made Nintendo a household name around the world in the 1980s? The answer, of course, is the Famicom, or as it was known outside Japan, the Nintendo Entertainment System. So Nintendo decided to re-release this first console, but in a slightly different form, presenting the NES Mini and the Famicom Mini. These are out of print, long out of print, so what if you want to play the games that are on here? I'm Retro Brendo, and this is how to play every NES and Famicom Mini game on the Nintendo Switch in 2023. Here is what I'm going to be outlining for you. First of all, which of the minis these games were on. After that, I'll be explaining how you can play it on the Switch. The first one is obvious, it's available on the Nintendo Switch Online service, but sometimes it'll only be available on the NES app, sometimes it'll only be available on the Famicom app, some are available on both. The next way some of these games are available is on the eShop. First of all, there are collections of some of these games, especially if they're from third-party developers, or occasionally you can't get the Famicom or NES version, but you can get the arcade original for games that were arcade ports. The final option is some of these games have been remastered. And now, without any further ado, let's get on with the games. I'm going to be going through them alphabetically, which means starting with the Famicom Mini. Let's go! Word of warning, the Famicom Mini controllers are tiny. I mean, look at this. You must have to have really, really tiny hands to... Well, looks like I'm okay. Atlantis No Nozo, or The Mystery of Atlantis, is a platform game available for the Famicom Mini and Famicom NSO app. It is really kind of terrible. It's almost entirely in English though, so grab it if you feel like screaming at the screen due to its randomly changing jumping mechanics. Seriously, I played this on a plane flight and wanted to hurl my Switch out of the window. Balloon Fight is a Nintendo classic. While it's simplistic, it's also quite charming. And it's easy to find as it's available on both the NES and Famicom Minis and both Nintendo Switch Online Famicom and Nintendo Switch Online NES services. Bobble is exclusive to the NES Classic Mini, and the NES version is not available on the Switch. However, the arcade original for this classic puzzle platformer is available from the eShop, and as a bonus included with the most recent game in the series, Bobble 4 Friends. Or Bobble 4 Friends, if you want to make it very clear that the 4 is a numeral 4 and not a FOR 4. Yeah, that's it. Castlevania is available on both minis, but Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest is exclusive to the NES Mini. Both games are available on the Switch as part of the Castlevania Legacy Collection on the eShop, which includes a bunch of other Castlevania games, including Castlevania 3 and Super Castlevania 4. The original Donkey Kong is available on both minis and both NSO apps. The sequel, Donkey Kong Jr., isn't on the Famicom Mini, but is present on the NES Mini and both NSO apps. Now, these are the home ports of the arcade games, which means the original Donkey Kong is missing the third level. But the arcade original versions are also available for purchase on the eShop. Remember when Mario was into animal cruelty? That's weird. No wonder Donkey Kong doesn't like him in the movie. Beat-em-up classic Double Dragon 2 The Revenge is available on both minis and both NSO apps. Double Dragon 2 is also available as part of the Double Dragon and Kunio-kun Retro Brawler Bundle Collection on the eShop. Sadly, the original Double Dragon isn't included on either mini or either app, so following the story might be a bit difficult. Anyway, if you want to follow the full story, the Arcade Archives range has Double Dragon 1 and 2 available as separate releases. Do you need to do Double Dragon 1 to understand Double Dragon 2? What happened to the second dragon? Downtown Nekketsu Kōshinkyoku Soreyuke Daiundōkai, or Downtown Nekketsu March Super Awesome Field Day in English, is a sports action game exclusively released in Japan. Unsurprisingly, then, it's available on the Famicom Mini and Famicom NSO app. It's also available as part of the Double Dragon and Kunio-kun Retro Brawler Bundle Collection on the eShop. This collection includes a total of 18 titles, including this game in English for the first time. Dr. Mario, one of the early games where we question whether a plumber can also be a race car driver, professional golfer, and in this case, virologist, is available on both minis and both apps. So is bicycle racing game Excitebike, and without a turbo controller, getting knocked down is just as hand cramp inducing as ever. Come on, get up! Thank you! Thank you! Each region of Mini gets its own Final Fantasy game. The NES Mini gets the original Final Fantasy, while the Famicom Mini gets Final Fantasy III. Final Fantasy III was the most popular game in the series released for the Famicom in Japan. The reason it wasn't so popular in the rest of the world is that, well, it was only ever released in Japan. The rest of the world jumped to Final Fantasy IV as the next entry, though it was released outside Japan as Final Fantasy II. Which isn't included here anyway. Look, this all made perfect sense in the 1980s, but it's rather annoying now. In any event, the Final Fantasy games are not available as part of Nintendo Switch Online. However, pixel remasters of Final Fantasy 1 through 6 are available in a collection and individually on the eShop. Shmup and Space Invaders Clone Made Good, Galaga is another game where the NES port is not available on the Switch. However, you can buy the arcade original version as part of the Namco Museum collection, and also individually as an Arcade Archives port of the original arcade game. Galaga is present on both the NES and Famicom Minis. Capcom's hard-as-nails action game Ghosts and Goblins is available on both the Famicom Mini and NES Mini. It's also available on both the NES NSO app and the Famicom NSO app. Just make sure you get the knife. Space-based shmup Gradius is available on both NES and Famicom Minis and both apps on the NSO. The original arcade version of Gradius is available on Konami's Arcade Classics Anniversary Collection. Now it's time for a few rapid-fire Nintendo classics. Ice Climber, The Adventures of Nana and Popo Endlessly Scaling Mountains is available across both minis and on the Famicom and NES NSO services. Its early stablemate, Kid Icarus, featuring the debut of Pit, Palutena, and Eggplants— no, not those ones, don't demonetize me, YouTube! Kid Icarus is on the NES Mini, but not the Famicom Mini. But don't worry, it is on the NES and Famicom NSO apps. Then there's Kirby's Adventure, which features on both minis and both apps. There's also the original single-screen bop-em-up Mario Bros, and that's available on both minis and both apps. Mega Man 2, considered by many to be the best 8-bit adventure for the Blue Bomber, who was absolutely not created because Capcom couldn't get the rights to Astro Boy, can be found on the NES and Famicom Minis. If you want to play it on Switch, you'll have to purchase the Mega Man Legacy Collection Volume 1, which features the first 6 games of the series, originally published for the Famicom and NES. If you have the expansion pass for the NSO service, you can also play Mega Man 2 in Mega Man The Wily Wars on the Mega Drive or Genesis app. The first adventure for bounty hunter Samus Aran, Metroid, is available on the NES Mini and Famicom Mini. It's also available on both the NES and NSO apps. Its Game Boy Advance remake Zero Mission has yet to appear on the NSO GBA app, but just give it time. NES Open Tournament Golf, a forerunner to the Mario Golf series, appears on the Famicom Mini but skips the NES Mini. Western players can still play it on the Switch NSO app for NES, and it's on the Famicom app too. While some of the third-party titles have not appeared on NSO apps because they're sold in their own collections, Ninja Gaiden graces both mini consoles and both NSO apps. Unfortunately, at the time of recording, the second and third games in the trilogy have not appeared on either of the NSO apps, and no collection has been released on the eShop. Pac-Man is another game which appears on both the Famicom and NES Minis, but on the Switch is only available in its original arcade form. Thankfully, that original arcade form is available in quite a few ways. Firstly, it is available as an Arcade Archives release, and then, like Galaga and other Bandai Namco games, you can find it in the Namco Museum collection, but also in the Pac-Man Museum collection. And as an extra in Pac-Man Champion Edition DX. There are basically a lot of ways to play Pac-Man on the Nintendo Switch in 2023, and to be honest with you, I've probably missed a few. Punch-Out! I had to shout that because it has 2 exclamation marks, featuring Mr. Dream, was not released on the Famicom Mini, but was put onto the NES Mini. This game is available on both the Famicom NSO app and its NES counterpart. River City Ransom is the reverse situation of Punch-Out! Sorry, I'll stop yelling, as it skipped the NES Mini, but was on the Famicom Mini. It's now available on both the NSO Famicom and NES apps. River City Ransom is also available as part of the Double Dragon and Kunio-kun Retro Brawler Bundle Collection on the eShop. Solomon's Key, a puzzle platformer, skipped over the NES Mini but can be found on the Famicom Mini. It's also made its way onto both the NSO and NES Famicom apps. StarTropics is the only game on this list not available on either the Famicom Mini or the Famicom NSO app. While the action RPG was developed by Nintendo in Japan, it was only ever intended to be released outside of Japan, and has not been officially released in its home country. You can play it on the NES Mini or the NES NSO app. In the run and gun category, the super hard but super satisfying Super C is available on both the NES and Famicom Minis. If you're from Europe, you might remember this game better as Probotector 2: Return of the Evil Forces. However, you won't find any version of this game on the NES or Famicom NSO apps. Instead, if you want to pick it up, you'll have to grab Konami's Contra Anniversary Collection, which includes not only this NES port, but also the arcade original Super Contra. The original Super Mario Bros. Trilogy, as far as the world outside Japan is concerned, is fully available on both Minis and both NSO apps. However, that requires a little bit of explanation. Super Mario Bros. And Super Mario Bros. 3 are present and correct, including regional differences from the respective releases. However, the Japanese original Super Mario Bros. 2, known as the Lost Levels outside of Japan, is not on either of the minis. Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels, or Super Mario Bros. 2 in Japan, is present on the NSO apps. Both minis, however, do get the Rest of World version of Super Mario Bros. 2, the famously reskinned version of Yumekojo Doki Doki Panic. In Japan, as the name Super Mario Bros. 2 was obviously already taken, it was instead released as Super Mario Bros. USA, and that's how you'll find it on the NSO Famicom app and Famicom Mini. Super Mario Bros. 2 is obviously available on the NSO app. Tecmo's American football game, Tecmo Bowl, was only released on the NES Mini, but is available on both the Famicom and NES NSO services. It's highly rated for a retro sports game, so give it a try if you like big shoulder pads and balls. Footballs. The egg-shaped ones. That you hold in your hand. God, it's a confusing name for a sport. I mean, it's also called gridiron. But there's no grids, there's just lines. And there's no iron. Another Tecmo sports title, Tsuppari Oozumou, focuses on the sport of sumo wrestling, and indeed, the name translates in English to bumping sumo. It's perhaps unsurprising then that you can only find it on the Famicom Mini and Famicom NSO service. Continuing the martial arts theme, Yie Ar Kung Fu is a title you can only find on the Famicom Mini and Famicom NSO service, despite the original game releasing outside Japan in the 1980s. The Arcade Archives version is also available on the Switch, however. With its more detailed backgrounds and sprites, you might want to check out the arcade original instead. Finally, it's the start of another seminal Nintendo game series, The Legend of Zelda and Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Both of these games are available on the Famicom Mini, Famicom NSO, NES Mini, and NES NSO services. And much like the Mario games, the regional differences are retained depending on the version you play, and that means graphical and music enhancements on Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, as the Japanese original was a release for the Famicom Disk System. However, you might run into some language trouble if you don't know much Japanese. Well, that pretty much wraps things up for our friends, the NES Mini and the Famicom Mini, and how to play their games on Switch in 2023. Now, if you've liked this video, please share it with your friends. If you haven't liked this video, share it with your enemies. But either way, please like, share, and subscribe. My name is Retro Brendo, and I thank you all very much for watching, and good night. Now, I have to wonder, you remember there's that bittering agent on Switch cartridges? Cherry! What about this one? Cola lollies! It's even a bit fizzy! I'm gonna go gargle with toilet duck.